The Speaker.
Almighty God, we give thanks to you, the creator of the universe, and humbly beseech you to direct and prosper the deliberations of the members of this house here assembled for the advancement of your glory and the trust and welfare of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Grant that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be established among us for all generations. Amen. Amen. Namaste.
Or affirmation, announcements by the Speaker.
Honorable members, Honorable Randall Mitchell, MP, member. Honorable members, Honorable Randall Mitchell, MP, member for San Fernando East, Mr. Rodney Charles, MP, member for Naparima, Mr. Fazal Karim, MP, member for Shogunas East, and Mr. Prakash Ramadan, MP, member for St. Augustine, have requested leave of absence from today's sitting of the House. The leave which the members seek is granted.
Bills brought from the Senate, petitions, papers.
Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper: the nomination of His Excellency the President in respect of the nomination of Commodore Anthony Stafford Franklin for appointment as a member of the Police Service Commission.
The Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following papers. Papers 2 to 3, the audited financial statements of the National Infrastructure Development Company Limited for the financial years ended September 30th, 2014 and 2015. 4, the report of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago on insurance and pensions for the year ended December 31st, 2014. I beg to move that papers 2 and 3 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee.
Honorable members, the question is that papers 2 and 3 be referred to the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The Minister of Education.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay on the table the ministerial response of the Ministry of Education on the first report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee on the examination of the audited financial statements of state enterprises, NSDSL, ETEC, NFM, NQCL, GHRS, NIDCO, and TTMF. Thank you.
Minister of Health.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following paper: the annual report on the administration of the Dangerous Drugs Act, Chapter 11.25, for the years 2015 and 2016.
Reports from committees, Prime Minister's questions, urgent questions.
Member for Point-a-Pear.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister of National Security, can the Minister state the number of murders and serious crimes that took place over the Carnival period, Friday 24th of February to Wednesday the 1st of March 2017?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the number of murders that took place between the period 24th February to 1st of March 2017, in fact, 7 murders took place during that period. with respect to serious crimes, 78 including the 7 murders, Madam Speaker.
Member for Faisabad.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister of Works and Transport, Honourable Minister, having regard to the massive sinkhole which developed only a few days ago along the roadway in Harris Village South or Approach, causing major disruption to the regular flow of vehicular traffic and posing a threat to the safety of both motorists and pedestrians alike, could the Minister please state when will urgently needed repair works be undertaken to resolve this problem?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This sinkhole was as a result of a leaking water main and was primarily the responsibility of WASA. Therefore, WASA undertook and completed temporary restoration measures on the 24th of February 2017. This involved the repair to the water main, backfilling the sinkhole, and the temporary restoration of the roadway. Permanent restoration will be completed by WASA by week ending March 11, 2017. During this time, the Ministry of Works and Transport officials will monitor the situation while WASA take the necessary precautions to guarantee the safety of both motorists and pedestrians. Thank you.
Member for Faisabad.
Could I ask if the Minister could indicate when the other major depressions and potholes caused by repair work by WASA along that same road, when can I expect them to be repaired?
Works and Transport.
Thank you. Madam President, the Ministry of Works, Madam Speaker, the Ministry of Works at this time are engaged in conversation with WASA to try to bring all the depressions on the road up to standard. Thank you.
Member for Princess Down.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to the Minister of National Security. In light of a recent newspaper report of an 8-year-old child being used as a sex slave and allegations by relatives who reported the matter that they received no assistance from the relevant authorities, could the Minister please state what is the current complement of officers at the Child Protection Unit and what is being done to ensure families receive the required assistance without delay?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I do not have the current complement of the officers of the Child Protection Unit. However, that can be provided at a later date or even later in the proceedings. What I do know is that the Tobago Police Service, through the Child Protection Unit, are putting in place a system where they can respond quickly to any such incidents. Madam Speaker.
For Princess Down.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Minister. Honourable Minister, could you indicate whether you are aware that last night a child was removed from the care of her alleged abusers? However, the Child Protection Unit indicated that it did not have an alternative accommodation for the child and placed the child in another relative's care, despite the relative advising the CPU that they were not in a position to properly care for the child.
Minister of National Security.
Madam Speaker, my information is that the Children's Authority has taken charge of that situation and the child is with the Children's Authority at this present time.
Questions on notice. Questions for oral answer.
Leader of the House.
Thank you very kindly, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we will be answering all the oral questions, save for question number 57. In relation to that question, Madam Speaker, we would request a deferral of 2 weeks. Madam Speaker, with regard to the written question, we have the answer to the written question. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Member for Naparimo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 44 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, in April 1993, Trinidad and Tobago adopted a floating exchange rate regime in which controls on current and capital account transactions were lifted and exchange rates were to be determined by market forces. To avoid exchange rate volatility, Trinidad and Tobago adopted a managed float. Consistent with this liberalized regime, the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, under the authority of the Exchange Control Act, is only responsible for licensing and regulating institutions, that is to say, authorized dealers, that can conduct foreign exchange transactions and therefore does not direct individual transactions by authorized dealers or specify the sector, institution, or individual to which the authorized dealers should sell foreign currency. Authorized dealers buy foreign exchange from the public, mainly the energy sector companies, and then sell foreign currency to their clients. In times of tightness, commercial banks may extend their trading positions or borrow foreign currency to sell to their customers. The banks are allowed to use their best efforts to determine genuine requests and distribute foreign exchange while managing trading positions. Answer to Part B. In accordance with the Exchange Control Act, Chapter 7950, foreign exchange management and intervention is the responsibility of the central bank, subject to appropriate consultation with the Minister of Finance. However, the Minister of Finance is empowered under Section 3.2 of the Exchange Control Act to give special or general directions to the bank with respect to the exercise of its powers and performance of its duties under the Exchange Control Act. The government is therefore examining its role in this matter at this time.
For Baratarisano.
Minister, could I just ask you a question? Would it make a difference and help the exchange rate and the controls if you make the US dollar the official currency of Trinidad and Tobago?
Minister of Finance.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Excuse me, could you repeat the question, please?
ID wasn't listed.
I take blame.
Minister, I was just asking, for my education as well as others, if the exchange control problems could be alleviated if you make the US dollar the official currency of Trinidad and Tobago for trading.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, with all the powers available to me, I can't see how that flows from the original question. Please put that in writing and I will answer it.
Member for Chaguanas East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On behalf of the member for Chaguanas East, question number 50 to the Minister of Education.
Minister of Education.
Madam Speaker, the Canopia Secondary School was reopened on January 9th, 2017 and is fully operational. Thank you.
Member for Chaguanas East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 50 to the question number 51 to the Minister of Education.
Minister of Education.
Madam Speaker, as I indicated to this Honorable House in June 2016, the opening of the Egypt Oasis Government ECCE Center, located in the HDC development called Lionsgate Development Construction at Dastrace Enterprise, is contingent upon several statutory approvals which were not obtained when the project commenced under the previous administration. The Ministry of Education, together with the Education Facilities Company Limited, is actively pursuing these approvals with the Housing Development Corporation, the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission, the Water and Sewage Authority, and the Chaguanas Borough Corporation, with a view to setting a date for the opening of the center. Thank you.
Member for Chaguanas East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 52 to the Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Flights BW 422 and 423, and not 424, from Tobago to JFK, New York, and JFK to Tobago, respectively, are not subsidized per se. Instead, the Tobago House of Assembly pays two Caribbean Airlines the additional costs incurred to route the flight through Tobago. Normal route to New York would have been Port of Spain to JFK on the outbound flight and JFK to Port of Spain on the inbound flight.
Member for Faisabad.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question 54 to the Minister of Health. Madam Speaker, I suspect there might be a typo in this question, Mount Hope. Can I ask that be struck? I think that changes the question. No, I'm saying that I think there might be a typo with Mount Hope being inserted in that question,
But
unless the Minister is prepared to.
Well, I think the Minister may be prepared to answer the
this
question as it is.
In that case, I may have to withdraw this question and resubmit it.
Minister, let's see the answer,
Okay,
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will gladly assist the member for Faisabad. The answer to the question as posed, the answer to Part A is no, and therefore, if the answer to Part A is no, B does not apply.
Member for Faisabad.
Can I, ask whether the Director of Women's Health in the Ministry of Health has been appointed? Minister.
No, I will answer.
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much. I will assist. The post of Director of Women's Health does not exist at Mount Hope. It is a position approved by the Cabinet to have oversight and leadership over the entire health sector for women's issues and infant health. The post was advertised on both the 4th and 5th of April 2016. Interviews were held on 13th of May 2016, and the Office of the Chief Personnel Officer was written on 7th July 2016. From that date to now, we have been in communications with the Office of the Chief Personnel Officer to settle this issue, and as of this morning, the Office of the Chief Personnel Officer indicated to us that it will be that the post or the position or the person will be appointed, in their words, soon.
Member for Faisabad.
I'll give it to member.
Member for Paray.
I just want to ask the Minister whether the CPO is in the process of appointing the person, or is it the Service Commission?
The CPO, sorry, I apologize. There has been a to-in and fro-in between the CPO and the Ministry of Health since July 2016 as to the terms and conditions. And that is where we have reached from July 2016 to now.
Member for Faisabad.
The Minister perhaps define soon, or what his expectations would be for soon.
Soon is the word given to us by the Office of the Chief Personnel Officer. Therefore, I, as Minister of Health, cannot put words into the mouth of the Office of the Chief Personnel Officer.
Member for Urupuch East.
Thank you very much. Is the Minister aware that the Ministry may also make an appointment with a provisional contract subject to the finalization of terms and conditions by the CPO?
What I have done, thank you very much. What I have done in the interim is appoint an ad hoc committee under the Office of the Chief Medical Officer to conduct the business of the Director of Women's Health. So the work continues without a substantive person in the position, but I have taken steps under the Office of the Chief Medical Officer to do just that. Thank you very much.
Member for Faisabad.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 58 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, respecting the time limit placed on responding to oral questions, I wish to advise that the terms of reference for the Manpower Audit Committee, charged with the task of conducting a manpower audit of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as requested in Part A of the question, will be circulated for the information of members. It is in fact a 5-page document. With respect to the expected outcomes, upon conclusion of the manpower audit, the resulting report will outline findings and recommendations regarding the adequacy or inadequacy of the current human resource capacity of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. More specifically, the report will identify any existing gaps in inter alia staffing, training, deployment, accountability, career advancement, and professionalism. Once these gaps are identified, the necessary mechanism can be put in place to address them, and in so doing, increase police effectiveness, which will no doubt redound to the benefit of the general public. Ultimately, given the present realities of crime facing the country, The findings of the manpower audit are expected to be utilized in making more informed decisions with regard to the future of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and crime fighting in Trinidad and Tobago. The terms and conditions of engagement of the committee are being currently finalized, Madam Speaker.
Member for Caroni East.
Through you, Madam Speaker, could the Honourable Minister indicate if he might be able to give an indication as to the completion time for this manpower audit so the country can understand what is going on?
Madam Speaker, I'm able to give that exact time at this point in time.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Minister, can you also, or would you also be able to give a cost for this manpower audit?
I'm unable to give that cost, Madam Speaker.
The adjournment of the House on definite matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers, personal explanations, introduction of bills, motions relating to the business or sittings of the House and moved by a minister, public business, government business, bills, second reading.
The Attorney General.
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Marriage Act, Chapter 4501, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Chapter 4502, the Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, and the Orisha Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, Chapter 4551, be now read a second time. Madam Speaker, Trinidad and Tobago is indeed a democracy which prides itself on advancing the best interest of its citizens. Our Constitution, our supreme law in this country, guarantees that it always speaks. The life and breath of our Constitution is one that runs through the veins and body of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. These laws are multifaceted, obviously, in that through the ages we're called upon as parliamentarians, those sitting for the time being in that honourable position, to deal with the development of laws in the best interest of our citizens. On this occasion today, the aim of this bill is squarely centered upon finding the best fit for an established protection for the children in our society. This bill, very short bill of just 7 clauses, including the title to the bill, is one which is intended upon developing just a few issues, really, when we quite look to the center points of it. We are certainly intended, in very simple terms across the marriage acts, to harmonize the age of marriage. The intent is to raise it to 18 years of age across the board. It's intended to harmonize all offenses across marriages. Excuse me, guys. It's intended to harmonize all offenses across the laws as expressed that are to be amended. It's intended to have a savings for marriages which have been conducted prior to proclamation of this law. It's intended to criminalize marriage officers who officiate in circumstances where they would be potentially dealing with child marriages. It criminalizes bad record keeping, because the records are the lifeblood of ensuring the accuracy of who constitutes citizen, where and how, and what rights are brought on by way of citizenship. Marriage being one of the methods by which one gains that. It allows now for a move in the time for what we call the move towards night weddings, where we change the law from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and allow an extension to 9 p.m. It allows for a harmonization and improvement of the regulations which are to be found as attachments to the primary laws which we now seek to amend. It allows for a harmonization of the schedules to the law. It importantly fills a lacuna in the law as we related to an omission in Section 13 of the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, where valid marriages were not referenced specifically to the existing law of Orisha, which came about in 1999.
It seeks to focus upon Trinidad and Tobago meeting its international reputation and expectations. Those stated summary bullet points are the main intentions of the 7 clauses of the bill, which is a package approach to amending a number of laws which have stood on the books of Trinidad and Tobago. I propose in this contribution to address the method by which we have arrived at this bill, the manner in which we engaged in consultations, the expectations which a society such as Trinidad and Tobago, which prides itself upon being a democratic country in the true sense of Section 13 in particular of the Constitution, if you look to that clause and the preamble of the Constitution, where the concept of proportionality has an expression in express terms in the Constitution, and also to look at a very large issue, a multifaceted issue which can really be labeled quite simply as the voice of the child issues. In looking at this, Madam Speaker, one needs to first reflect upon the laws that actually are in existence right now. When we look to this phenomenon of child marriage, we're seeking to have amendment to 4 marriage laws, one including a divorce law. Specifically, the Marriage Act, Chapter 4501, is a law which came about by way of Act number 13 of 1923. That was amended some 18 times last in 2013. The Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Chapter 4502, was an Act of Parliament number 7 of 1961. That's been amended some 4 times. The Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, is Act number 5 of 1945, having been amended some 9 times, last in 1993. The Orisha Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, is Act number 22 of 1999. Those are the 4 pieces of law where the age to contract marriage issue arises. Specifically, this issue of child marriage, which has come to national attention over the years, from time to time it has come to prominence and fallen apart, is something which finds direct expression in these laws I've just mentioned. Section 8 of the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act prescribes that boys can be married at 16 years of age, that girls can be married at 12 years of age. The Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, prescribes that men at 18 years of age can marry girls at 14 years of age. The Orisha Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, at Section 9.1, prescribes that men of 18 years of age can marry girls of 16 years of age. The Marriage Act itself, which is where civil law or Christian law falls into perspective, prescribes that there's no real expression of age. And therefore one falls by way of interpretation back to the canon laws which find themselves as part of our basis of law, where boys at 14 years of age can marry girls at 12 years of age. Now, Trinidad and Tobago has had, fortunately, quite a bit of experience in consultation, but not quite a lot of experience on statistical appreciation of where we stand. Indeed, I was reminded by one of the persons who attended at public consultations at the now Radisson Hotel that he had attended a consultation led then by the member for Siparia, who was looking at the issue of child marriages, and that was sometime in 1998 or 1999. He had returned to consultations in 2016 and told me of this gap of some 17 or 18 years in consultation. But the statistical appreciation of where we stand has really been a figure which has not found itself into modern expression, certainly by a sitting government, by my reflection, at all, in any real or meaningful way. And therefore, it is incumbent in demonstrating the legitimate aim of this bill for me to traverse some of these statistics. And permit me, Madam Speaker, in traversing some of the statistical appreciation that we should have in mind in establishing a legitimate aim and the proportionality of the kind of law which we seek, to demonstrate multiple issues on the voice of the child. I propose to deal with the number of child marriages, the types, the distribution spread across the individual marriage categories, and also to deal with the larger voice of the child issues which relate to abuse or teenage pregnancy or other factors. It's interesting to note, Madam Speaker, and I'm sure the population will well remember, that the Attorney General's office, in fact, had 4 consultations. We began a consultation in the Attorney General's chambers. We continued to the Magdalena Grand as the last one. We passed through the Radisson Hotel, and we had another consultation at the Hyatt. Those 4 consultative elements included consultation with a number of religious entities, a number of religious leaders. Certainly one, that at the Hyatt, was exclusively geared towards the children of our nation, and it was a very vibrant, door-busting sort of approach and consultation where we heard from the young people in Trinidad and Tobago their respective views across the multiple religious platforms. But when we originally began the consultation, we had traversed only, in terms of the period 2006 to 2016, out of a total of 84,330 marriages over that 10-year period, we had found 548 marriages, 117 of them in the civil category or Christian category, 328 in the Hindu category, 103 in the Muslim category, 0 in the in extremis category, which is where people can be married where one of the parties is dying and as prescribed by the civil marriage prescriptions in the Marriage Act. And under the Orisha, for that 10-year period, 0. What we did, Madam Speaker, by way of update of figures, we went back to the statistical information available at the Registrar General's office, and we traversed the number of marriages from 1996 straight up to 2016. And we tabulated the total child marriages, and we came up with a number of 3,478 marriages. There were 3,478 child marriages from that period, 1996 to 2016. When we broke it down, we found that the category of civil or Christian marriages represented 1,156, or 35.25% of those marriages. Muslim marriages were the least in the category at 526, representing 15.1%. Hindu marriages were the largest in category, representing 1,796 marriages. But when we went further into the position, I invited the ministry to print off all of the marriage certificates for a 10-year period, so that further information could be gleaned from the marriage certificates themselves. Because as the laws prescribe, what we notice is that you have not only expressions of gender, male and female, not only expressions of religion, but you actually have occupation as well. And when we came across this information, when we looked to the distribution of the gender issue, we found that of the 3,478 marriages, 3,404 of those were for girls, and a whole 74 in that period, 1996 to 2016, only 74 of them were men. Statistically, that shows a gender disparity of 97.85% female and 2.156% male. Madam Speaker, what we found very interesting on the analysis of birth certificates of marriage certificates was a very interesting phenomenon where we looked at, Madam Speaker, sorry, Paray, would you just mind the running commentary? It's a little bit distracting. Thank you. I understand, sorry, I was just expressing. So, Madam Speaker, what we found inside of this particular position, when we looked to the representation of state or occupation of the persons who were married, we found a very startling phenomenon. The phenomenon that we noticed spread across years, and I took a sample of them from 2006 to 2016. The occupation of the male was a very interesting category. Also against the age of the female and the age of the male. The fact is, in Trinidad and Tobago, in 2016, we have had child marriages. The fact is, in 2015, in 2014, in 2013, in 2012, right down to 1996, we've noticed that we continue to have child marriages. In 2016, we certainly had children at the age of 14, girls being married, 15, 16. We found in that particular period, there were 53 marriages in 2016. That's to give you the number of current marriages in the year just concluded. When we looked to the information on the occupation of the male, listen to what we found. For a 13-year-old female, her husband's occupation was security officer. 14-year-old female, security officer. 14-year-old female, husband's occupation, laborer. 15-year-old female, married to security officer. 15-year-old female, married to no profession listed. The age disparity included figures of a 23-year-old marrying a 13-year-old, of a 40-year-old marrying a 15-year-old. But when we go through the occupation, they ring almost true this way for every child marriage. Laborer, laborer, security officer, joiner, welder, gardener, plastic machine operator, sales driver, doubles vendor, pipe fitter, laborer, no occupation, sanitation worker, watchman, mason, trainee logger, soft drink salesman, tile layer, vegetable farmer, doubles vendor, fisherman, mason, tractor driver, steel cutter, laborer, fast food attendant. That last one, fast food attendant, in 2008 saw marriage to a 12-year-old girl, where the 12-year-old girl was marrying a well-employed husband who was a fast food attendant. When we look to the list going further, we had a 14-year-old girl. The occupation of her husband, as she was married at 14, was secondary school student. Farmer, mason, laborer, garment importer, sales clerk, farmer, truck driver, laborer. We continue down. 2011, scrap metal dealer, mason, laborer. 42-year-old man marrying a 15-year-old girl where his occupation is laborer. We go down 2012, 2013, it continues. We see a 13-year-old marrying a student as occupation. We see a 13-year-old marrying a student again. We notice a 13-year-old marrying someone with no occupation. So what we're looking at when... Sure.
I just wonder if you have the religious disposition of these people you're speaking about, the different religious... Yes. Okay. Yes. Could you name some?
Sure. Hindu, Muslim, Christian. And why I've tried not to, and I thank the member for the intervention, why I've tried not to fix this to any one religion is in recognition of a very unfortunate dimension to this argument which has materialized, which is a wrong statement that this thing is attractive of only particular religions. Let me dispel that right away. This is not a Hindu, a Muslim phenomenon at all. The statistical information shows us that Christians are equally in the same category. But there has been an unfortunate painting of this issue as something which is to be owned by Hindus or owned by Muslims when the information does not demonstrate that, and it must be entirely rejected, which is why I have not dealt with it by way of describing when this happens. I thank you for your intervention. But why I address this particular issue of age, of positions, of occupation, is to add it on as well to the analysis that we did to demonstrate that across Trinidad and Tobago, this phenomenon of child marriage is not a rural phenomenon. In fact, what we notice statistically is that this phenomenon is very much an urban phenomenon. Because in the marriage certificates, we also located the argument where a number, the vast majority of these marriages were really occurring in the urban centers.
in Port of Spain, in San Fernando, in San Juan, in different areas regarded more as metropolis than urban. In fact, the urban areas had a very low tendency to produce child marriages. Now, Madam Speaker, when we go a little bit further into this analysis, and we're looking again at the statistical position, when we look at the 2016 figure again for child marriages, I want to put that in terms of a gender statement. The gender statement at that point was that 98.15% of child marriages in 2016 were attributed to female and 1.85% only attributed to male. And you will notice that this particular position of child marriages is one which has been explained by some to include some of the goals of what child marriage is intended to deal with. Now let's pause for a moment. This is a very heartfelt issue. It's an issue where a number of people in our society have spoken up. As I indicated, it's not the first time that we've had consultations. Indeed, Siparia, as Member of Parliament, held consultations in the then Hilton Hotel in 1998, 1999, back again in 2016. But it's something which touches the chord of many hearts in our society. And in touching this chord, we look to some of the statements, heartfelt statements, as to the bona fides for maintaining child marriages. And some of them have actually come across by way of expression of saying, look, this is to keep religious convention or practice alive. This is to avoid unmarried women becoming mothers, i.e. to deal with the concept of teenage pregnancy. This is perhaps an expression to allow two people who are in love, a wonderful phenomenon, to actually be married, provided that they pass through the safeguards of consent and parental consent. These are some of the arguments which find themselves not unique to Trinidad and Tobago, but across the globe where this phenomenon exists. But when we look to this religious argument, I think it incumbent for us to claw back to the position of where we, as persons who have descended or come from different areas of the globe, be it Mother India, Mother Africa, Mother Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Mother Asia, China, wherever it may be, the position is that globally, this particular position is one which has, forgive me for forgetting Diego Martin Northeast, Mother Europe as well, but what you may not know is that he's also Native American, Indian in descent as well. But what we actually have inside of this is a reflection back to the so-called motherlands. And when we look to the motherland phenomenon, when you traverse the globe, you notice that it is by far a true statement to say that most of the sub-Saharan, African, Middle Eastern, Asian entities, countries, actually prescribe an age of marriage which is usually 18 years and above. Mother India, for instance, since 1955, in outlawing child marriage, prescribed an age of 18 years for girls and 21 years for boys. That's Mother India in 1955. Be it other jurisdictions like Bangladesh, where it's 21 for boys and 18 for girls. Or when we traverse across Central Africa, where we see 18 years across the board, or Cambodia, 20 for boys and 18 for girls. Egypt at 18. What we notice is that much of the so-called motherlands or traditional territories that one thinks of in the East have actually raised the level of age, where the religious persuasion arguments have been very loud on the maintenance of convention. Now notice I've paused on the word convention, which I propose to come to when I deal with constitutionality in a little while. But on the issue of convention, when we come to the Western world, we find that there is, in fact, in some cases, for instance, in the United States of America, there's no prescription of age in certain states, whereas there are prescriptions of age in other. Or in some jurisdictions, you find a hybrid approach, which is 16 years with certain exceptions, usually where there's parental consent, and sometimes including a judicial process of consent being provided by a court. But, Madam Speaker, when we come right back to Trinidad and Tobago, what we're really touching upon when we go into statistics, as we go into the next element of statistical appreciation, in particular touching that argument of teenage pregnancy and dealing with the issue of the voice of the child, it's incumbent to also look at what we found in our own jurisdiction relative to teenage pregnancy and relative to children. What we found, Madam Speaker, in the exercise which we did, and I would invite all members to certainly look at the Attorney General's and Ministry of Legal Affairs website, where a slideshow has been uploaded since last year relative to this particular issue. What we noticed in Trinidad and Tobago was that teenage pregnancies are a very large phenomenon. Now, I know the member for Sawa Barataria had spoken of this, as did the member for Caroni East on several occasions when they sat as ministers of government in the last government, an issue which they sought to pour some light on and draw attention to. But, Madam Speaker, the statistical information shows that over a period of 1999 to 2015, our country has witnessed 15,231 live births to children. What is even more startling in that figure is the age gap that one notices between the mother and father. And the statistical information is there on the website again. It's to be found at the Attorney General's website. We have in Trinidad and Tobago, mother at age 14 having a child for a man at 24. Mother at age 13 having a child for a man at age 24. Mother at age 15 having a child for a man at age 36. Girl at age 15 having a child for a man at age 55. So we're seeing a gap of years between mother and father expressed on the live birth certificates for children, which demonstrates a very significant problem. When we look to how that problem relates to the voice of the child today, we notice that the argument that one can avoid teenage pregnancies and unwed mothers by having child marriages feeds into that whole voice of the child issue. But, Madam Speaker, when we look to the births which didn't make successful live birth, those which were dealt with by way of abortion, where you dealt with an unwanted pregnancy, those that are actually reported in 2016 alone across Sangre Grande Hospital, Mount Hope Women's, Port of Spain General, San Fernando General, and Tobago, for children who turned up for abortions between the ages of 11 and 16, we saw 173 in 2016. For children who turned up for abortions between the ages of 11 and 16 for the 2016 period, we saw that total of 173. That has got to be a very startling phenomenon, because it does not include the private abortions, the backyard abortions, the neighbor abortion. So when we rank now the issue of live birth, the issue of teenage pregnancy, the potential for child marriage to solve that, the question is, statistically, does this find itself as a method for solution? Because what we don't have in our jurisdiction is any analysis at all on the state and living condition of children who get married. I have, I believe, for the first time as a member of a government, put out the information as presented today. And what is really required, if we want to think about the correct solution for our society, is a proper investigative opinion on whether this thing is best for the child or not. Because when we looked at the gender disparity of 98.5% odd female versus 1.5% male, and I'm rounding figures, when we looked at the fact that the phenomenon still exists, when we looked at the live births, when we compare it against the occupation of father, and you notice that the vast majority of fathers from the marriage certificates, or the vast majority of husbands from the marriage certificates, are actually people who are not best employed, you now come to analyze the issue of voice of the child as to whether we are in fact prescribing the best method to treat with children so that we can be compliant with our laws of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the international laws which we have associated ourselves with by way of entry into treaty. Let me start with the international perspective and then work my way back to the local laws. The issue of child marriage and international convention, Madam Speaker, is to be found squarely in a number of pieces of law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Consent to Marriage Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriage, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, Slave Trade, Institutions and Practices, the International Labour Organization's Convention 182, the WHO Constitution, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment, and regional treaties. Those are the international conventions. But the laws of Trinidad and Tobago themselves have a suite of considerations for us. They find themselves in the package of children's laws. They find them specifically referenced in Section 3 of the Children's Act number 12 of 2012, where a child is defined as someone who is under the age of 18 years. We find it specifically in reference to the laws which are actually much older than that. And I deal specifically with the Age of Maturity Act, Chapter 4606, which was a law brought into effect by Act number 28 of 1973 on the 15th of November 1973, and also specifically the Infants Act, Chapter 4602, brought into effect by Act number 28 of 1925 on the 18th of June 1925. But what is interesting in the Age of Majority Act is that Section 2 brought the age of majority down from 21 to 18. That's when an adult was created at law by an amendment to the law as happened in 1981. And we specifically allowed in Section 7 of that piece of law to have infants now referred to as minors. But what's interesting is the Infants Act. In the Infants Act, in particular, reference to sections 19, 20, 21, and 24 are very, very interesting, particularly because they prescribe the circumstances in section 19, for instance, where contracts by infants are to be void. Section 20, no action to be brought on ratification of an infant's consent, meaning if an infant entered into or purported to enter into a contract whilst an infant under 18 and sought to ratify it even with valuable consideration after turning 18, it was still void. But under the infant settlement provision in section 21, girls and girls alone are allowed as infants to make a settlement in contemplation of marriage. But our laws allow for boys to be married. Hindu laws don't allow for boys to be married because you must be 18, you're a man. But the Christian law and the Muslim law certainly permit 16 years or lower 14 years for the Christian position by virtue of canon law importation. And the Part 4 of the Infants Act really prescribes that sale of infants' estates, that you must go through judicial process to touch with anything which becomes what we call a settled estate. In other words then, the rights and privileges of children as it relates to land or property are strictly regulated in law such that people under the age of 18 years cannot manage their property. Now when you add up the Infants Act, the Age of Majority Act, you add up Act number 12 of 2012, which is the Children's Act, you put them under the umbrella of the international conventions which brought us to Act number 12 of 2012, the Children's Act, and you see that our democracy, Trinidad and Tobago, is settling itself across the board such that a child is someone under the age of 18 years. And therefore, we are normalizing and settling what is now to be viewed as the settled democracy of Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll come to that on constitutionality, and I'll come to that on the position of proportionality specifically. But Madam Speaker, what we have running in our country right now is the position of when is enough enough? When does one stop consulting in a democracy which is not a theocracy? Because we recognize in our Constitution the fact that we ascribe to democratic principles, not squarely theocratic principles, meaning religious principles. We value in our Constitution a number of rights expressed as entrenched rights. Be they the entrenched rights that we look at for equality of treatment and protection of the law. Be they, and that's to be found in section 4B, be they the right to an individual to respect for private and family life, which is section 4C, or the rather contentious one, which is the freedom of conscience and religious belief and observance. And let me now therefore begin the foray into the constitutionality of this type of law by making the statement that the establishment of religious convention or practice is not one to be associated with religious belief squarely. And let me explain two examples, or give two examples. One could argue that it is religious belief that an adulterer must be stoned to death. It finds itself in expression in religious texts. One could argue that the concept of sati, which is where a female, a woman whose husband died, voluntarily commits herself to death by burning in a funeral pyre, that is something to be found anchored in religion. One could allege that an eye for an eye is still, by virtue of Old Testament prescription, the prescription of religious belief, or a tooth for a tooth. The question is where our society locates itself in democratic belief as opposed to theocratic belief. And therefore one must distinguish the argument of religious belief versus religious convention. And religious convention is religious practice. And not everybody has the same practice, which is why we essentially have a law which says that the majority position is to prevail by virtue of the circumstance in which our constitution and political environment is organized. Now, Madam Speaker, this is not a novel concept. The concept that entrenched rights may sometimes be touched is not novel. Let's start with the Supreme Law of Trinidad and Tobago, so called so by Section 2 of the Constitution. That Supreme Law of Trinidad and Tobago, in recognizing through its preamble down to the Section 4 right, says that rights can be abrogated, that rights can be accepted by virtue of them being passed, if necessary, with a special majority, to different levels of entrenchment. In the Section 4 and 5 rights, there are 3/5 majority by virtue of Section 13 of the Constitution. But the qualification to that to be found in Section 13 is that it must be reasonable in a society such as Trinidad and Tobago, which accepts democratic principles, and I'm paraphrasing. And I think it's safe to say, post-Northern Construction case, which is the Section 34 case in the Privy Council, and post the CLICO policyholders case in the Privy Council just last year, any court of law will have regard to what our democracy expresses in looking to whether something is in fact one which requires majority or not, by way of expression in a bill. Specifically, Madam Speaker, I wish to point out, I think it was Baroness Hale who got it squarely correct in Surat number 1. And I want to read Surat number 1 squarely into the record. It's 2007, to be found at 71 West Indian Law Reports at 391. It's the UK Privy Council decision. And in particular, in that particular law, the Equal Opportunities Act 2000 was being looked at. That Equal Opportunities Act was passed with a simple majority. It was not implemented by the then government, as there was certain judicial process afoot. Certain persons went to the courts and brought a claim against the government, asking for the government to actually implement the law and claiming that they had had some breach of rights. But it was Baroness Hale in particular that gave an excellent piece of law and statement of the law which prevails today, which I'm compelled to read into the record. The appeal, this is to be found at paragraph 58, where she gave the judgment of the Privy Council with only one lord accepting himself from that. The appeal will also be allowed on the other points where the courts below found the Equal Opportunities Act unconstitutional. It cannot be the case that every act of Parliament which impinges in any way upon the rights protected in sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution is for that reason alone unconstitutional. Legislation frequently affects rights such as freedom of thought and expression and enjoyment of property. These are both qualified rights which may be limited, and here's the point, either by general legislation or, in the particular case, provided that the limitation pursues a legitimate aim and is proportionate to it. It is for Parliament, in the first instance, to strike the balance between individual rights and general interest. The courts may, on occasion, have to decide whether Parliament has achieved the right balance, but there can be little doubt that the balance which Parliament has struck in the Equal Opportunities Act is justifiable and consistent with the Constitution. Section 7, in that case, does impinge upon the freedom of expression, but arguably goes no further in doing so than the existing law. If it does go further, by including gender as well as racial or religious hatred, it is merely, and I stress, bringing the law into conformity with all modern human rights instruments, which include sex or gender among prohibited grounds of discrimination. She went on, Sections 17 and 18 do impinge upon the freedom of contract, but in ways that are now so common in the common law world that it can hardly be argued that they are not proportionate to the legitimate aim which they pursue. Finally, adding to the role of the Judicial and Legal Services Commission in exactly the way contemplated by Section 111 is not inconsistent with the Constitution. Let me summarize the golden points in the ratio decidendi of Baroness Hale in that case. 1, not every law requires a 3/5 majority. It may be prescribed by general legislation. Number 2, the qualification to that is that it must be proportionate. It must have a legitimate aim. It must intrude upon the right only so far as is necessary. And it must be essentially balanced in the kind of democracy that we have. That's to be found most recently in the Privy Council expressions in the Northern Construction case, etc. Loads of case law on it. But the fact is, there are no absolute rights in our country. So position number 1, are we dealing with practice or are we dealing with belief? Secondly, in finding the general expression of what Trinidad and Tobago finds palatable, Madam Speaker, it is critical for us to understand that what we are dealing with when we look to this kind of law and its proportionality is a balancing of rights, a balancing of the individual right versus the general interest, as Baroness Hale put it. And the individual rights which we're looking to, Madam Speaker, I remind, are the Section 4B, Section 4C, and Section 4H potential rights. And for that reason, Madam Speaker, bearing in mind the statistical information coming in Trinidad and Tobago and not elsewhere, what we're looking at is a statement where girls are being discriminated against in our country. Look at the Hindu Marriage Act, 14 years for a girl, 18 for a boy. Orisha, 16 and 18. That, Muslim in a different percent, 12 and 14. 12 and 16. Christian, 12 and 14. The gender disparity by the statistical information is 98% girls. What happens to the girl in the circumstance I've just described? At 13 years old, being married off to a laborer, to a gardener. What do you think her estimation of chance of success in education, in successful childbirth, in advancement of her career is in our country? Is this a statement of general interest to our people of Trinidad and Tobago? Is it an expression of where Trinidad and Tobago's democracy is to say that by passage of a bill of this kind, we are in fact normalizing the common law of Trinidad and Tobago, the established, filtered through perspective of international convention which we have signed? I accept that international law is not brought into the lex loci until it is encapsulated in enabling law. I accept that. But the Privy Council accepts that there's a flavor and infusion of interest into our laws by way of expression. I want to reference, Madam Speaker, quite an interesting case that I did together with several other attorneys. It was a case called Ray Ajura. In this particular case, I acted together with other lawyers for the Criminal Bar Association in finding an expression of the right of a juror. How much more time do I have, Madam Speaker?
Seconds.
20 seconds, Madam Speaker. There's so much I could speak about. Let me wrap it up. Madam Speaker, the 7 clauses on this bill which deal with a simple harmonization of age, of offenses, etc., which I expressly set out in a very short bill, are legitimate in aim, proportional, they're justifiable in a society such as ours. The bill before us is one with noble intent, and I believe it is high time that we agree as a society to deal with this law in the manner suggested. I beg to move.
Honourable members, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Marriage Act, Chapter 4501, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Chapter 4502, the Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, the Orisha Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, Chapter 4551, be now read a second time. Member for Princes Down.
Madam Speaker, first let me take the opportunity to indicate that we, the members of the opposition, fully support the minimum age for marriage to be at 18 years of age. Madam Speaker, this particular issue has been a highly emotive issue in our country. It has brought several persons to the forefront in terms of giving their opinions in terms of underage marriage. Madam Speaker, one of the main issues that has evolved from this particular bill, having come to the Senate and now here in the House, is the issue of the 3/5 majority. Madam Speaker, we have seen and heard from commentators, whether it was Michael Harris, Ralph Maraj, other political entities in our society, those from civil society as well, indicating that they do not agree with the Honourable Attorney General with respect to removing the 3/5 majority with this particular bill. Madam Speaker, the recent statements of the Attorney General that the government would not be hampered by the opposition's unwillingness to support certain pieces of legislation, and he intends to eliminate the need for 3/5 majority support, is deeply disturbing to us and troubling, as they are a direct attack on our democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law here in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, these are the fundamental principles that bind us together as a people, and I was very happy to hear the Honourable Attorney General go at great lengths to indicate what our rights and freedoms are enshrined in our Constitution. Madam Speaker, 40 years ago, in delivering the judgment of the Privy Council in the landmark and celebrated decision of Hines versus the Queen, Lord Diplock, in speaking about the entrenchment provisions of the Constitution, stated, and I quote, "The purpose served by this machinery for entrenchment is to ensure that those provisions which are regarded as important safeguards by the political parties in Jamaica, minority and majority alike, who took part in the negotiations which led up to the Constitution, should not be altered without mature consideration by the Parliament." Madam Speaker, I'll repeat that, should not be altered without mature consideration of the Parliament. Madam Speaker, again, the Honourable Attorney General went at great lengths to speak about Baroness Hill. He spoke about the case dealing with Surat, but he has been cherry-picking, Madam Speaker, in terms of the information that he provides on this particular issue, because he does not go into the law with respect to the judgment given in Hines versus the Queen with respect to Lord Diplock's judgment. Madam Speaker, that in itself speaks about the rights and liberties that is enshrined in our Constitution. And today, the Honourable Attorney General cannot tell us whether in this Parliament or in the Senate, where did he get the advice that this bill at first needed a 3/5 majority? Subsequent to that, in typical flair, he comes back to the Senate 1 week later and then says, we are removing the 3/5 majority, but up to today still cannot indicate first who gave the legal opinion for the 3/5 majority, and now who has given the legal opinion to remove the 3/5 majority. Madam Speaker, I am deeply concerned because it tells me that this government is hiding something. And this is a history that we continue to advocate on this part, that you cannot trust this government. There's always been an agenda in which they hide information. They skew what is said in the public domain, Madam Speaker. And then they present to us information without giving us the opportunity to find out who are providing these legal opinions. Madam Speaker, the AG spoke about constitutionality, and I will go into that a little bit later on into the debate. Madam Speaker, he spoke about international obligations. However, again, cherry-picking which international obligations he chooses to articulate. Because, Madam Speaker, in my presentation, I will show that there are international conventions and reports that are in conflict with what the AG is saying in terms of international law and international treaties with respect to the issue of child marriage. Madam Speaker, the AG spoke at great length about consultation. He spoke about Paray having consultation at the Hyatt, at the Hilton, at the Radisson. Madam Speaker, again, backtracking from the original position of consultation, the AG then comes weeks later talking about consultation. Yes, we have consulted with the civil society groups. We have consulted with religious organizations. Weeks later, the word consultation is removed. And we are now hearing about a national discourse, a national conversation on the discussion on this particular issue. Madam Speaker, we are hearing today and in the past from organizations that represent civil society that they were called into meetings and they were spoken to and never got the opportunity to reply. Madam Speaker, as far as I am aware, that is not the meaning of consultation. But again, the AG comes today to talk about consultations, when in truth and in fact there was nothing of the sort that took place. Madam Speaker, in dealing with this particular bill, we have to look at the balancing act in terms of those that support the 18 years across the board without any provisions for exceptional circumstances. But there are those in the society who have also called for these exceptional circumstances. And the AG said, when is enough enough? So is it, and he goes again into great length to talk about religious freedoms and liberties and so on being in terms of our beliefs in the Constitution, but refuses to acknowledge that there are groups in the society, which he did not mention at all, calling for specific provisions. Now, Madam Speaker, I, as a young person, I'm very happy to give a voice to this particular issue that many consider to be and speak about as the Child Marriage Bill. Madam Speaker, Sparrow sang a calypso. Age is just a number. In the verse, it says, age is just a number in a controlled state of mind, but maturity is always better. It is on that point, Madam Speaker, that I note as a young person myself that the maturity and experiences that we have gained over time helps to shape our perspectives in a more comprehensive way, which allows for us to make better informed decisions in the life choices that we make. Madam Speaker, in preparing for today's debate, I looked at civilizations and countries whose views have evolved on this particular topic of underage marriages. Madam Speaker, in 1108, the first female to have challenged the right to ascend the British throne was the Empress Matilda. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England, and at age 4, Matilda's hand in marriage was promised. Madam Speaker, at age 12, Matilda was married off. Madam Speaker, this was not a religious issue. It was not an issue of the rights of women and girls. It was a societal norm. It was a norm that advanced countries, their legacies, and some would say monarchs, but this also extended to several classes and classifications of society in now a metropolitan United Kingdom, as well as other parts of the world that is predominantly Catholic. Madam Speaker, this was not a marriage under Hindu rights. This was not a marriage under Muslim rights. This is what was accepted by society during that time. And I was very happy to hear that the Honorable Attorney General indicated to us that there were those in our society who was coloring this issue with respect to religion. And I was very happy to hear when the member for Barataria Sanwan got up and he asked for the Honorable Attorney General to indicate what religions some of these marriages took place under. And Madam Speaker, from that time of 1108, we have consistently through the history seen the issue of child marriage come up without any dialogue in terms of any controversy over this particular issue. From 1108 come up. Madam Speaker, there were many countries, there were many countries by the 18th century started to take on this particular issue and bring clarity to this matter in terms of being against child marriages in many civilizations, even though it continued to exist. Madam Speaker, from the 18th century, when this started to become an issue in terms of the rights of the child and so on, let's fast forward to 1967, where the United Nations themselves, as the Honorable Attorney General tells us about the international law and the international treaty. In 1967, where the United Nations themselves was confronted with a situation that had existed for several centuries that appeared to need reformation based on a society at that time becoming socially and morally conscious that there needed to be limits and also provisions for exceptional or extraordinary circumstances. And that is why I come back to the point, Madam Speaker, of those arguments being put forward by the international law and international treaties that the Honorable Attorney General speaks about is in conflict with themselves. Madam Speaker, similarly, the United Nations recommendation on the consent to marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages. The recommendation required consent of both parties as well as registration of the marriages. The recommendation also mandated that member states specify a minimum age to marry and does even further to set as a recommended minimum age for marriage to be at 15. Just like the Convention on Consent to Marriage, however, the recommendation allows for exceptions to this minimum age. Madam Speaker, this was a General Assembly resolution in the year 1967, Resolution 2018. Madam Speaker, this was the year 1967, and in that United Nations resolution, we saw the evolution of thinking by the world body that represents 193 nation states. The argument being put forward in that resolution of the United Nations Division for the Advancement of Women expert group meeting on good practices in legislation to address harmful practices against women, while several countries reached this stage prior, where we spoke about in the 18th century when it started to become an issue. Several countries had started to look at their domestic legislation in terms of the protection of the child, of whether it was 18, 16, or 15. But we are seeing in 1967, when the United Nations General Assembly resolution was passed, Madam Speaker, that they themselves were in conflict because they understood that while this scenario existed, that we wanted a minimum age of 18 years old, they also passed a resolution to indicate that they were looking for provision for member states to look at the age of 15 in terms of that provision as a loophole to deal with exceptional circumstances. Madam Speaker, since the 1965 resolution of the General Assembly was passed that year, the United Nations understood that there needed to be a provision, as I said, because of the context of many socio-economic and cultural issues that may have arisen. From the advancement of a provision of 15 years was advanced to address the issue of special circumstances, and a framework was laid out in terms of how it was to be approached by the establishment of these UNICEF subcommittees. Madam Speaker, since then, there has been much discussion and advancement on the issue of equal rights for men and women, and the advancement of women in particular and their own freedoms and liberties. Madam Speaker, on September 5th, 1995, the issue of child marriage and forced marriage was again placed as a priority issue to be dealt with and gained the international spotlight once more, when then First Lady and a woman herself, who has been a symbol, especially in most recent times, as advocating for the empowerment of women and girls, said at a Beijing session of the United Nations Fourth World Congress in Beijing, China, said that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. That again, Madam Speaker, pushed the issue of child marriage back into the spotlight on the international stage. The conference confronted how the world viewed child marriages and forced marriages, among other issues, and helped to shape the way forward for the protection of children, not only girls, but boys as well. Madam Speaker, history shows us that the way society once viewed a particular issue can be changed with time, with information, with education, and with knowledge. Madam Speaker, here we are today again, where one Calypsonian tells us 75 cannot go into 14, but fails to identify that this was once accepted in every civilization and instead targets a Hindu community here in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, while that same 75-year-old Calypsonian attempts to school communities here in Trinidad and Tobago by misrepresentation and skewing of information, but does not say that while a Hindu, Muslim, and Orishas have ages below the minimum age of 18-year threshold, he does not inform us that there are other groups, such as the Christians and the civil marriages, that have no minimum age requirements. None. In fact, Madam Speaker, to be fair, Madam Speaker, let us see what canon law says, and the Honorable Attorney General went into some of this. In fact, Madam Speaker, as I said, to be fair, let us see what canon law says for the Catholic community. And you would know that over 1 billion people worldwide subscribe to the tenets of the doctrines of Catholicism. Catholic canon law existing in 2017, emanating from the Vatican to this day, according to canon law 1083, this is what it says, and I quote, "A man before he has completed his 16th year of age, and a woman before she has completed her 14th year of age, cannot enter into what they call a licit marriage or a valid marriage." That is why, Madam Speaker, in the 21st century today, information also comes with responsibility in making informed decisions, such as the ones we are attempting to make today in this Parliament. But instead of dividing communities and painting public figures into a particular light to suit your own political persuasion, Madam Speaker, if for Hindus the Calypsonians are asking if 75 can go into 14, can we not also ask the same of the Catholics in the interest of fairness? Madam Speaker, UNICEF commissioned a report published in January 2016 looking at adolescent rights in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I heard no mention of this UNICEF report by the Honorable Attorney General. One would have thought that if we are looking at specifically dealing with child marriages, forced marriages, that you would have looked to see an international body like UNICEF, who has published a report on January 2016, most recent, to deal with adolescents and issues that surround and affect them in the Caribbean and Latin American region, that this is an area that he would have looked at. And again, it asks the question, who have they been consulting with? Because the Honorable Attorney General made no mention of this specific report. And Madam Speaker, if you look at that report, it tells you of so many of the issues that are confronting young people, especially with the issue of child marriage and forced marriage in the region. Madam Speaker, in that particular report, as I said, published in January 2016, this is what it said. When exceptions to marriage at an earlier age are allowed in exceptional circumstances, the absolute minimum age is not below 16 years. Grounds for obtaining permission are legitimate and strictly defined by law, and marriage is permitted only by a court of law upon full, free, and informed consent of both the child or both children who appear in person before the court. Madam Speaker, this is where it gets interesting. The report says the cautious evolution in the committee's approach to child marriage may be explained by pragmatism in light of sometimes difficult situations in which adolescents may find themselves. For example, when expecting or having a child, given the high rates of adolescent motherhood in various countries. In keeping with the committee's overall approach, it also seeks to recognize the evolving capacities of children to make decisions about their own lives. Madam Speaker, this particular report looked at what was happening with adolescents in Latin America and the Caribbean and saw a need for provision like the one being advanced by several in the public domain. We've seen that the network of NGOs has advanced that there must be a provision in the law which they are calling for, together with the Hindu Women's Organization as well, which is a part of that particular network. Madam Speaker, the provision to be made for exceptional circumstances, it dealt significantly with the realities that confront many of our countries in that report. Those from the most rural areas, and again, the AG spoke about those rural areas, and he said it's happening in more of the urban centers. But Madam Speaker, the realities that are confronted in many of our own constituencies, a lot of these issues are underreported in rural areas. And that is what this specific report tells us, Madam Speaker. And therefore, we are dependent here in Trinidad and Tobago with the CSO statistics. There is very little research that is coming out from any other entity to provide us with the underreporting of some of these child marriages, teenage pregnancies, or forced marriages. Madam Speaker, the report looked at a child's ability to make informed, rational decisions at age 16 with respect to their education, with their desire to join the work market, and also the issue of medical consent. Madam Speaker, it looked at the Caribbean and Latin America region in terms of the growing numbers of child or underage marriage or forced marriage. Madam Speaker, the report showed that across the region, Trinidad and Tobago was among the countries with the lowest number of child or forced marriages. Madam Speaker, it said that the primary objective of setting minimum ages in legislation is to protect adolescents from harm. Yes. Legal minimum ages aim to protect adolescents from making choices and/or from taking responsibility for actions that they do not have the capacity to understand in their entirety and comprehend the full consequences. The rationale is not to limit the exercise of adolescents' rights, but to ensure that adolescents are protected from actions that could potentially impair the current or future realization of their rights. It is not about protecting society from adolescents, Madam Speaker, but about ensuring that adolescents can develop to their full potential in a protective environment. And I think The Honorable Attorney General's intentions are noble, Madam Speaker, just like ours on this side, where we have indicated that we are in full support of the minimum age being 18. But, Madam Speaker, legal age for consent to marriage. Yes. For this reason, Madam Speaker, it is essential that a process of setting minimum ages be adolescent-centered and focus on the best interests of adolescents. Madam Speaker, a decisive dimension of any discussion around minimum ages relates to the notion of consent. The establishment of a minimum age to undertake certain acts or be responsible for certain actions is a legal recognition of the child's ability to consent, hence the validity of this consent. Adolescence is a time when children are more likely to look for new experiences and take risks. Adolescents may be subjected to various forms of pressure from their peers, older persons, their parents, and from the community and society. Legal minimum ages recognize that for some actions, implications for adolescents' rights and their lives are so important that their consent cannot be considered valid under a certain age. This is the case for marriage, for example, to which children should not be legally able to consent before 18 years of age or under strict review and exceptional circumstances. Sexual consent is another area which older persons may lure adolescents into sexual activity they may not genuinely want or that may lead to unwanted pregnancies or sexually transmitted diseases. Madam Speaker, what is very interesting, and I'll go through the key points of this UNICEF report published again in January of 2016, was that they called for the establishment of legal minimum ages across the board as a requirement under international standards. They said minimum ages aim to enhance adolescents' protection from rights violations. They do not seek to limit the exercise of their rights nor hinder their increased autonomy. Discussion around minimum ages should tackle the question of consent and who can give it, with great care in order to ensure that transfer of consent to the parent or legal guardians does not undermine adolescents' legal protection. By representing objectives and universal criteria, minimum ages protect adolescents from marginal groups, from early choices, and from discriminatory practice. They therefore constitute important tools for equity. In the light of the indivisibility of children's rights, consistency among minimum ages in different areas is critical and calls for a holistic approach. Madam Speaker, having said all of that in the report, you know what the report goes on to say? It says, but the reality of many of these Caribbean and Latin American countries, because of the socio-economic conditions, because of the problems that exist in terms of family and the breakdown of family life in a lot of the Latin American and Caribbean countries, should look at the issue of a provision of having, and they suggested here in the report, Madam Speaker, either 15 or 16 years old. And again, Madam Speaker, we are seeing that even these international bodies like UNICEF, the United Nations, and all the subcommittees, they are in conflict with each other because they are seeing the realities that exist through these reports. And therefore, when the Honorable Attorney General comes and tells us, well, we must meet international obligations and international treaties, please tell us specifically which one are you referring to? Because they are all in conflict with each other, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, again, it comes back to the point where the AG has been cherry-picking on these particular issues in terms of the information that he puts out there in the public domain. Madam Speaker, do you know right here in the Caribbean, in Suriname, in 2004, they were faced with a very similar situation, like here in Trinidad and Tobago, with the issue of bringing up the minimum age for marriage to be 18. And they face a lot of the same cultural problems that we do here in Trinidad and Tobago because of the makeup of our society ethnically and so on. And what they did was that they passed a special act known as the Asian Marriage Act for persons who have specific beliefs to be married under this particular act. And Madam Speaker, I mean, this is not something that I am particularly advocating for, but I'm showing that in different regions, they understand the complexity of the society that they live in. Madam Speaker, while Suriname, as I said, is very similar to Trinidad and Tobago, you can look around many other different parts of the world which has passed legislation similar to the one that we do. Right in the United States of America, Madam Speaker, None of the states in the United States of America has 18 as a minimum age for consent for marriage, Madam Speaker. None. Madam Speaker, in some of the states, actually, which I found to be quite interesting if you look at the Florida law says that if you are married under the age of 18 with parental consent and so forth, that if your spouse dies before you are 18, you do not need parental consent, you can just remarry. And again, Madam Speaker, it's a highly complex issue, but what is happening across the world is that they are understanding the complexity again of the societies. And therefore, I find it rather unfortunate that the Honorable Attorney General comes and gives a blanket statement and say 18 and to hell with everybody else. Madam
Your language. Please comply.
My apologies, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, child marriage is not the only issue affecting children in our country. You would have seen today, I asked the Honourable Member for Point Fortin about an 8-year-old child who has been brought into the public domain via the newspaper with respect to the issue of being used as a child sex slave. And Madam Speaker, I asked the Honourable Member through the question time to indicate whether or not the CPU, the Child Protection Unit, has been able to offer any assistance. Madam Speaker, my information is the Child Protection Unit has put back the child in the custody of another relative.
On the question, could you please?
Sure. Madam Speaker, it brings me back to the point about this is not the only issue affecting children in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, the Honourable Attorney General, when he spoke in the Senate with respect to this particular bill, he made certain statements in terms of the government's assistance to children. And this is what he had to say, as he triumphantly said that these were the government's achievements in helping children in our nation. And this is what he had to say, Madam Speaker, I quote, "What else are you doing about crime? How many children have died? What is going on in the society? Well, let me put on record, this government has been very careful to bring to the fore the support services that are required to articulate with particular positions." Madam President, this is what he says in the Hansard, Madam Speaker. By cabinet decision as cabinet minute number 333 of March 10, 2016, we put on the record that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service was given the capacity for 169 police officers to form the formal established Child Protection Unit of Trinidad and Tobago. Again today, the Honourable Minister of National Security cannot tell us how many there.
Ready?
Sure, Madam Speaker.
That. Could you kindly move on?
Yes. Secondly, he said, Madam Speaker, the member in the Hansard says, the Honourable Attorney General, and I quote, "We certainly also had the Cabinet under Prime Minister Rowley deal with the government's guarantee of loan arrangements and meeting of financial obligations, to deal with the construction projects, to deal with gender and child affairs issues, specifically the Repo Rehabilitation Facility site."
The original 30 minutes have expired. You're entitled to 15 more minutes if you intend to avail yourself.
Thank you, yes.
You may proceed.
Specifically, the Repo Rehabilitation Facility site, the modernization of children's home, the rehabilitation facilities for girls and boys projects in relation to children, the instituting of the formalized project for the Institute of Healing, the reduction in designatees for institutes, the Showrunners Assessment Center, just to name a few. St. Michael's School for Boys, St. Mary's Home for Children, Place of Safety. The Honourable Member, Madam Speaker, goes on in the Hansard to say, or talk about all the training that is being provided in these institutions for the staff there in terms of rehabilitation programs for children that are at risk. Madam Speaker, when I read the Hansard, I found that these words were very familiar. And something told me, go to the report of the Child Protection Task Force. And I turned to the Child Protection Task Force that was established by the member for Paray, then Prime Minister, in December of 2013. And having established a Child Protection Task Force in September 2013, Madam Speaker, the member for Paray gave the task force specific mandates to look at what were the issues that were affecting children and to see what recommendations that they could come up with that we can implement. Madam Speaker, When I read the Honorable Attorney General speaking about the Aripo Rehabilitation Center and the St. Michael's Home for Boys and the St. Mary's, that they were building all these things. Madam Speaker, when I looked in the Child Protection Task Force, do you know it was a People's Partnership government that started all of those projects? All of those projects, Madam Speaker. Then the Honorable Attorney General goes on to say that the Prime Minister guaranteed loan agreements. Madam Speaker, those projects have already had their funding, and what Honorable Attorney General was not being honest. Madam Speaker, a lot of the accomplishments of that child...
One, I'd like you to come back to debate, and in terms of, have your language more consistent with what is parliamentary, please.
Madam Speaker, the reason for me raising the issue of the Child Protection Task Force is that one of the recommendations in that Child Protection Task Force was for us to consider having a provision in law for marriage to be considered for special circumstances at the age of 15. But again, the Honorable Attorney General is nitpicking in terms of what accomplishments, what recommendations, what achievements he wants to select from the Child Protection Task Force report. You know, Madam Speaker, I recall that the Honourable Member for Siparia, and no one can deny, Madam Speaker, that a member for Siparia did more for children than anyone in this country has ever done.
I've warned you about relevance. Please come back to the bill that is before us. Okay? I think you're responding to something, some contribution. Please come back to what is before us.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the issue of the marriage bill, which again we are debating here today, also has to do with a lot of what the Honourable Attorney General has said in terms of what we are doing for children. And again, that is why I raise these particular issues, because these were the recommendations of that particular task force that I did not raise, but the Honourable Attorney General raised. Madam Speaker, I will move on from that.
Member, if you're talking about the task force, as it relates specifically to the bill that is being debated, I will allow that. If you're going on to anything extraneous to what is being debated, I am not going to allow. I've already said that, so coming back and explaining it to me again is not going to change my point of view. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, I spoke about some of the recommendations coming from the UNICEF report. And that UNICEF report that dealt with child marriage and forced marriages, Madam Speaker, had many recommendations. And again, it is in tandem with what the other reports commissioned right here in Trinidad and Tobago had to say. So, Madam Speaker, while we on this side are in support of the minimum age of consent to be 18 years, we are also saying that there are other voices that need to be heard. And it cannot be that the government takes a position that they are holding fast to their position, that they are not considering that there may be other circumstances here in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, again, one of the particular issues that we are concerned about, and many in this country have spoken about, is the issue of the explanation given by the Honourable Attorney General with respect to the removal of the 3/5 majority. I know that there will be other members who will speak
earlier. Please move on. You have a couple minutes more. Please move on.
Madam Speaker, we have seen in Trinidad and Tobago that there have been many issues that deals with our rights and freedoms. Again, today we are dealing with another one. And Madam Speaker, I am reminded that there has been so many issues in this country that deals with children, that deals with the rights and freedoms of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which the AG has been absolutely wrong in providing advice or in his statements and comments. Madam Speaker, if you would permit, the Daily Express, Thursday, March 3rd, 2016, today, again says AG is wrong, and continues in that vein, Madam Speaker.
Member, I think we are all quite aware about the rule relating to display.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to finish in the vein that I started, which is that there are many organizations and many institutions throughout this country, as well as I've explained in that UNICEF report, as I've explained in several other documents that exist, that these views on the issue of child marriage is conflicting views. There has been very little harmonization, as the Honorable Attorney General said, that the international organizations are asking for us to harmonize our legislation with respect to child marriages. But, Madam Speaker, when the UNICEF report, and I saw that particular issue where they're talking about being in conflict of each other in terms of the evolution and evolving from their original position, Madam Speaker, it tells me that right here in Trinidad and Tobago, who knows, years from now, our position might change from where it exists based on what is happening in our society. We may actually move it up to maybe 21 years old. And there are other jurisdictions and other areas that addresses some of these things. But, Madam Speaker, some of these issues are particularly with respect to Trinidad and Tobago, with respect to Latin America and the Caribbean, and I ask that the Honorable Attorney General take a look at that UNICEF report. We have heard no mention of it because it also goes on to speak about, Madam Speaker, not only child marriage and forced marriage, but other areas, and the Honorable Attorney General told us that this is one low-hanging fruit, and he will be looking at other ways in which we can protect children. And hopefully that legislation will come with respect to the issue of medical consent, with the issue of education, with the issue of the labor force. Those are other areas outside of the child marriage and the forced marriage areas that I am sure that the Honorable Attorney General will want to look at in terms of the protection of the rights and freedoms of children in particular, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, with respect to the child marriage issue, you would have seen just recently in the United Kingdom that there was a particular Pakistani family that tried to get one of their girl children, their daughters, married under the age of 16. I think the UK right now has the age limit to be at 16. And, Madam Speaker, the child seek to have themselves emancipated. And these are a lot of surrounding issues that has not been dealt with. I think these are other issues that need to be ventilated. You are seeing a higher level of youth involvement with respect to crime and criminal activity, and in terms of whether or not these youths are trying to emancipate themselves, or whether or not the breakdown in family life here in Trinidad and Tobago. You know, Madam Speaker, when I spoke about that calypso, one person told me, they said, but why aren't these calypsonians talking about underage girls in communities where they exchange sex for a box of Kentucky Fried Chicken, where they have so many children that they don't even know who the fathers are of these children, and these are happening in communities here.
Member, again, I've allowed you some leeway. Please get back to the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, yes, member for Laventille West, we know it is...
Princess, please address your contribution to me. Member for Laventille West. Please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General raised the issue of the statistics with regards to teenage pregnancy and went at great lengths speaking about abortions and so on. But, Madam Speaker, he did not indicate to us what were some of the remedies that they are looking at to deal with these issues. There's no remedies in any of this, Madam Speaker. It tells us all what the problems are, all what the statistics are, but there are no remedies. Madam Speaker, do you think this marriage bill is going to drop the teenage pregnancy rate in Trinidad and Tobago? Do you think that this marriage bill is going to solve the problems that deals with in communities like those from Laventille West? Madam Speaker? Madam Speaker, this particular issue does not address many of the problems that the Honorable Attorney General, and that is why he can say that the statistics are looking at urban centers. And which constituencies are urban centers, Madam Speaker? Which constituencies? Exactly, and tell us, Madam Speaker, what are the remedies. So you are saying you know what the problem is, but you cannot say what the remedies are. Because, Madam Speaker, they do not have the political will to deal with the problems in our country today. Madam Speaker, as I wrap up, we on this side will be proposing amendments at the committee stage. We'd like to provide notice to members of the government. But, Madam Speaker, as I've indicated time and time again, we are in full support for ensuring that the minimum age for marriage in terms of consent is 18 years old. But what we are saying is that there are voices in our communities, there are voices in our country that needs to be heard. It cannot be done through a national discussion where you are spoken to and not given the opportunity to speak on behalf of your community and your organizations. Madam Speaker, I am hoping that the Honourable Attorney General in his wrapping up will provide some clarity in terms of several of the issues in terms of that specific UNICEF report, and tell us that while these international organizations are badgering us to have 18 years across the board, why are they in conflict with their own arguments, Madam Speaker? Madam Speaker, there are many other countries, as my colleagues will speak, they will indicate to you what is the existing laws in some of these countries. But we cannot come here and say, Madam Speaker, blanketly 18 years old without understanding the realities that exist, not only here in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the world. Again, Madam Speaker, we are in full support of the 18 years minimum age for consent. But again, Madam Speaker, we will advance our amendments in the committee stage. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Tobago East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to join this debate. This is a very, very historic moment and important for not only the children of Trinidad and Tobago today, but those to come. Madam Speaker, before I go into the meat of the discussion, I want to just address a few things that the Honourable Member for Princestown would have raised. He noted some concerns about who would have guided the Honourable AG in terms of the special majority, and he went quite a bit in terms of that, Madam Speaker. But, Madam Speaker, on the 26th of February 2017, in the Daily Express, Dr. Arif Balkaram, Senior Lecturer of Law at the University of the West Indies, and also a co-author of a text, The Fundamental of Caribbean Constitutional Law, and he noted in the Express, Madam Speaker, the AG is on solid ground by insisting that special majorities are not required for every law that impacts on fundamental rights. Ultimately, any law that restricts rights is subject to judicial review by the courts, which will decide. Madam Speaker, it's very important to me as a young politician that whenever I come into this very honourable chamber, that I try not to politicize everything and to really speak to the people of Trinidad and Tobago and reflect the voice of the people that elected me to represent them. Madam Speaker, I would have structured my presentation, but I would just want to go and add a little bit and answer a few of the queries raised by my very honourable friend from Princestown. He noted there was no consultation, there was just discussion. Madam Speaker, I attended the consultation in Tobago, and I was proud when I saw the turnout. The old came, the young came, but most importantly, we had a wide cross-section of young Tobagonian girls and boys at that consultation. Madam Speaker, they were all given the opportunity to share their views. And one thing keeps ringing in my head as I reflect on that particular consultation. It was a young girl, and she said, well, if it's real love, they go wait till it's legal. Madam Speaker, if it's real love, why can't we wait until we're legal? What is wrong in waiting for a child to mature enough into a responsible young adult before they enter into something so sacred, so serious as marriage. Madam Speaker, I remember at the age of 22, when I announced that I was going to get married, people in my community were saying to me, and even to my parents, she's too young, let her go on further studies. At 22, I had already graduated from university. I was marrying a guy I would have dated, I would have grown to love, and people were saying that I was too young. So if in 2002, they were saying 22, too young, how come today in 2017 we could be arguing about under 18? Last night I went back to Tobago to my constituency. I had a meeting with the different groups in Mason Hall. And at the end of the meeting I asked them, I said, today we're going to be debating a very important bill. And I want you to remind me again, what is your position? And Wax, a very well-known cultural activist, said to me, he said, if under 18, you can't decide who's going to run the country. Under 18, you can't sign no kind of contract. Why under 18, you want to go and put somebody to marry? But marriage is a contract. And a contract that you should enter in ideally for life. And Madam Speaker, the sentiment of Wax wasn't unique to him. That was shared throughout all of Tobago East. Whenever I asked persons, what are your views in terms of child marriage, they said, if it is that we have decided in our country that a child is someone 18 years and younger, let us allow that person to enjoy the process of childhood. Let us allow that person to grow and thrive and try to realize their full potential, instead of encouraging them to enter into something so sacred, so serious as marriage. Madam Speaker, today what we are trying to do is not only protect the rights of our children, but to address a series of conflicts in our laws. We are saying that at the age of 18, we're not allowed to have sexual intercourse. But then, Madam Speaker, by the act of marriage, you're required to have sexual intercourse. The Bible says that as a wife, you're supposed to submit unto your husband in terms of sexual requirements, and the husband likewise. So if you're saying that an 18-year-old, someone under the age of 18 should not engage in sexual intercourse, and by allowing them to get married under the age of 18, there's a conflict in the law. Madam Speaker, we need to address that. And I want us to address it today, not because of who is here today, but because of the children who are looking at us to set the path for them, Madam Speaker. I have two little girls. The oldest just turned 11. And I try to picture my little 11-year-old girl under, because the statistics shows most of the girls married bigger men. I try to picture my little 11-year-old baby under a big man, and my skin crawl, Madam Speaker. And when I think of the whole issue of the child marriage, I try to picture other young, innocent girls having to endure that because it comes with the terrain. Madam Speaker, the honourable member, my very good friend from Princestown, spoke about different conventions. But when I listen to the Honourable AG, I don't think he premises arguments or the fact that we need to do this based on international conventions, but based on the fact, Madam Speaker, that we have to do what is right now for the children of Trinidad and Tobago. There must come a time when we have to step away from consultation and say, yes, we have consulted, we've had enough, and for us to be brave enough, because it's a matter for all of us in this honourable house to be brave enough to take a bold step and do what is right and say, yes, we have consulted, but now it's time for affirmative action. Madam Speaker, the time for affirmative action is now. Madam Speaker, they would have, during the period leading up to this debate and during my discussions with constituents and people in general throughout Trinidad and Tobago, and even the NGOs, and I want to acknowledge the presence of some of the NGOs, those of the NGOs and child advocates here today. they would have noted that in principle, they support 18. However, some are arguing for certain conditionalities, and I believe that's what Honourable Member for Princeton was coming to. But, Madam Speaker, there comes a time when we have to say, well, you know what, where do we draw the line? Where do we say, well, this is the baseline, this is where we're going to stand, and this is where we're going to move on with? Madam Speaker, 18 for me is the baseline. I remember in Tobago, the Honourable AG asking people, so what are your views? And a lot of young Tobagonians were saying 25, 30, and the AG was looking at us like, 25? You're really conservative? And I remember a mother got up and she said, my daughter isn't here today, but she asked me to come and express her views. But I thought my daughter's view was so strict that I said, well, you know what? I was going to, as the mother, will compromise. So 18. Mr. AG, remember that? The daughter was proposing 30 years old as the legal age for marriage. You know, so sometimes it's important for us as parents to really be the voice of reason and set the benchmark. Madam Speaker, some person would have argued that we're discussing child marriage and the figures are small. There are more important issues for us to discuss as it pertains to children. However, you know, it's there in the discussions coming up. People have said that, no, if you look at the percentages are small. However, Madam Speaker, if you look at the percentages and we say it may appear to be small, if you translate that into other forms of abuse, say sexual abuse, we would argue in this House that 1 is too much. And I'm sure my colleagues on the other side would agree with me. We would argue that 1 is too much. So for those who may be saying that...
Could the member please give way?
Sure.
I just want to ask you a question and to get your input. Would you then agree then that we need sexual education in primary schools?
Mr. Honourable Member for Samoa Barataria, the subject, that is not the subject matter of the debates, but I would be willing to share with you my personal experience, right, growing up in Tobago. There was once a program run by the Family Planning Association of Trinidad and Tobago where persons 13 and younger were trained to be peer counselors. And I was fortunate enough to be selected as part of the cohort for training. And what I would have seen are those of us who were trained to be peer counselors and peer educators, we were able to work into our classrooms and influence our peers. And I often boast that the year group that I graduated with from Bishop's High School in Tobago, no one got pregnant under the age of 18. That is my personal experience. However, my honourable member and Madam Speaker, this government is committed and looking at all angles to address the holistic development of our children and to ensure that our children are well educated to make reasonable, correct decisions. Mr. Honourable Member for Samoa Barataria. Madam Speaker, I just wanted to address something that came up in the newspapers in preparing for the debate today, and it is the whole matter of the age of consent. Madam Speaker, statistics are showing, as I said before, that more and more girls are getting married, not to men or boys closer to the age, but the statistics would have revealed they are getting married to much older men. There was an argument saying that why don't we put something in place to protect those close in age who may want to get married. But, Madam Speaker, and they would have looked at the Children's Act and the Romeo Clause. Madam Speaker, the data, the trend is suggesting that girls are not getting married to boys closer to the age, they are in fact getting married to older men. And for me, when I looked at the data and I started analyzing it, I was saying, I wonder if it is a matter of older men preying on younger girls and then using marriage as a cover for that. And it had me thinking along that line, because I'm saying if it is that girls 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 were falling in love, then it will translate into girls getting married to boys along the same age group. And, Madam Speaker, that is not what the data is showing for us here today. And I want us all in this House to think back. Think back when you were 16, Madam Speaker. Do you remember the guy you loved at 16? Did you marry the guy you loved at 16, Madam Speaker? Okay, honorable ladies in this house, how many of my honorable colleagues in this house could think back to 16 or 12 or 14 and say, well, you know, I got married to the guy of my dreams. Most of us when we look back would say, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? You know, so at the age of 12 or 13, do we reasonably expect our girls to say, well, you know, this is the man of my dreams, this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with? Or would our boys honestly say, this is the girl of my dream, this is the girl I want to spend my life with? At the age of 16, Madam Speaker, I was still a naive teenager running around the schoolyard and the village, playing with my friends and my brothers and sisters, you know, just doing what children would do. Marriage was nowhere in my psyche, and for lots of Trimbegonians now, a lot of our children now, at 15, 16, 17, even some at 18, marriage isn't in their psyche. They are thinking about maybe what I want to be when I grow up, what subjects I want to pick for CXC, you know, what I want to do after school. They're thinking about making a full-time, lifetime commitment of picking somebody to settle down with, raising children. Madam Speaker, I am 37 years old now, and I have 3 little children. And even at this age, to manage those 3 children is about, imagine a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old having to try to balance children, a household, and all of that. And politics. Madam Speaker, it is hard for them. It will be difficult for them. The other thing I want to raise, Madam Speaker, is what the Bible says about the ideal marriage and the ideal woman, the ideal husband. And the Bible describes us as a virtuous woman, a woman who is able to do commerce, to support her husband. A girl at 12 who has been forced to leave school, she would not have had the opportunity to go and maybe further education, to develop a skill so she could become that ideal, virtuous wife who could go out into the fields and help her husband to harvest and to support the family. So by giving our girls the opportunity and our boys the opportunity to live their childhood, have a fun, innocent experience, give them the opportunity to really blossom into who they want to be. What we can see ahead is a trend and Tobago hopefully will be more productive, one where we have men and women who are grounded, men and women who are serious about what they want to do and see what the contribution they can make to the development of this beautiful two-lined nation. Madam Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague on the other side for Princeton for saying up front that they would support the bill today. He said they would support it. That's the first thing I wrote down, Madam Speaker. So I want to encourage them in the vein of us putting aside our political differences for once and focusing on our nation's children, focusing on what is right in principle. That if we could just set aside the differences and focus on what is right in principle. Today, Madam Speaker, we could make history in this honourable House. We could all go down in history as being the ones who stood up, took a bold step to safeguard the rights of the children of Trinidad and Tobago. Despite the animosity that may have existed, we could go down in history as being the ones who would have said, you know what, today, politics is not our first priority, but ensuring that we do what is right for the girls of Trinidad and Tobago and the boys of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, I had a very, very long contribution prepared, but I believe in those very, very short words, I would have given you what I believe are the basic principles that we must live by, Madam Speaker. And is that whenever we come to serve, we don't serve only ourselves or a particular interest, but we look at the wider good. We look at those who would have been out there supporting us, who didn't support us, and for the common good, we do what is right, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, with these very few words, I say thank you.
Member for Mayaro.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to contribute to an act to amend the Marriage Act, Chapter 4501, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Chapter 4502, the Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, the Orissa Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, Chapter 4551. Madam Speaker, what the government has asked us to do today, basically, and I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, is to rationalize across the board the age of marriage in this country. And based on the acts that we are trying to amend, it varies from 12, 14, 16, and so on. And by rationalizing the age of marriage, there is no consideration of class, religion, social background, wealth, religion. And I am tempted to agree with my honorable colleague from Tobago East, as a father also of 3 teenage daughters, who I would prefer to get married at the age of 30. Because, oh, not at all. They're free to stay at home in my house for as long as they wish. And I had to agree with nearly all of what you said in terms of how we as parents look at our children. But outside in the public domain, Madam Speaker, you've had various opinions in the newspaper, social media, I've listened to radio shows, and the opinions are as broad as they are, as complex and as deep as they are. But what we cannot miss is that the fact that the bill is a complicated one. And the reason why I say so, and perhaps if it was not a complicated one, the Attorney General may not have opted to remove the 3/5 majority. But why is it a complicated one in my respectful view, Madam Speaker? It's that it's the first bill that I have encountered in 17 months that all the views are correct. All the views of all the stakeholders are correct. I take the view of the government, the Attorney General, and there is strength in what he has said, there's strength in what the legislation intends to do, and there is correctness in it. But there is also correctness in the views of the religious organizations that have spoken in the other place and the views that they have brought to the public domain. They are correct in some of their positions. The views of the NGOs and the civil society groups have also made their voices heard. And I have received several letters and reports from various groups. And they too are correct in their moorings in terms of what they are looking for. And last but not least, my colleagues here on the opposition benches, we too are correct in our views and in our position in terms of what will be put forward this House before the sitting is over today. So, Madam Speaker, that in itself leads to the complexity of the bill and what we as legislators ought to do by the end of the sitting today. I would just like to briefly go through a bit of the 4 areas on where the correctness lies. In terms of the Attorney General's position, in terms of what the government is attempting to do with the bill, and I agree with him that we must harmonize the marriage age with the legal age of sexual consent. There can be no argument about that. And secondly, we must harmonize our laws with the various acts, declarations, and treaties that we have signed to in the international arena. So there can be no argument that we must agree to those areas. Madam Speaker, in a bit more of the contentious component is what are the views of the various religious groups that have spoken on the matter. I am a practicing Hindu, Madam Speaker, and I too follow several of the tradition and cultures of the faith. And I too have found myself in a bit of conflict in agreeing, disagreeing with the various views coming out of that grouping. But why are they correct, Madam Speaker? All of them? It's because I think they understand the reality of daily life. All the religious groups, they understand what happens in the real world. And I'll explain that in a little more detail, Madam Speaker. Let us see what is the reality in the society based on, let's take a measure of our denominational schools. And I'm not saying that the data may not be the same for the government-assisted schools and so on, but since we're looking at the religious groups, what is happening to our young girls in school today? In the Catholic schools, in the Hindu schools, in the Muslim schools, in the Presbyterian schools? The young girls are excelling. They are doing better. They are doing better in most instances than the boys. They are entering the top schools. They are winning the scholarships. And young single women are spread throughout the workplace today. So the question that a lot of my constituents have asked is, MP, if the reality that our young girls are doing so well and they are not being forced into marriage, that's the reality of it, then why are the religious groups insistent that the legislation not be touched or not be varied in any considerable way? That's a real question. If it doesn't reflect the reality, why are we keeping it? And I remember in the other place when Senator Mahabir spoke, he had an explanation for this, and I don't want to quote him in any way because I can't remember word for word, but what he explained, that to find the answer, he had to go to Africa to find the answer. And in Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, he understood, what I understand, that the religious groups understands that things will fall apart. Don't matter what we pass in this house as legislation, and we firm up the age of 18, things will fall apart. It's not a perfect world. Young children will fall in love, they will break away from home, they will get involved with one another, and they'll do things. It's natural. And why the religious groups understand that also is because when things fall apart, the mothers and fathers reach by them, not by me. The mothers and fathers reach by the pundits, by the priests, by the imams. And I am sure that those of the civil service organizations, the NGOs, I think people reach by them when things fall apart. So that is why their views must be taken into consideration. There's another argument that one person brought to me, that we are a secular state, that religion should really not have a role in how we legislate. But that can't be so, because the fundamental act of marriage is one. By God, there is religion in the act by itself. It's sacred. So it is unfair to tell the religious organizations that you have no place in how we legislate in this country. And by that very reason, Madam Speaker, when we start our proceedings here in this House, we say a prayer and we invoke the Almighty. So there is no reasonable way in my mind as a legislator that the views of the religious groups should not be taken into consideration on how we legislate today. Madam Speaker, the NGOs and civil society groups, some of who are present here today, and whose reports have been widely circulated, I guess, through every single member in this House, they have asked, and again, to agree with my colleague from Princeton here, and perhaps I should have said this up front, I am in total support, like every one of my colleagues on this side that the legal age for marriage should be 18. That goes without question. For consent, for marriage, 18. What our civil society groups have been asking is that because of the reality of the situation, which cannot be divorced from how we legislate, we need something to fall back on for when things fall apart. And they have asked, and through amendments which will come up at the end of this discussion when we go to committee stage, that we put the 16 to 18 with all the different clauses and conditions to guarantee that certain circumstances should allow an arrangement. And I think we have enough problem when we say child marriage. But at 16, we are talking about the marriage of young adults. Because 13, 14, 15, 16 is out of the question. So I think what the NGOs and civil society groups, plus those on this side, are asking is that the opportunity, because of the reality of today, that some opportunity exists to deal with the situation when the things fall apart. And as I said, they, plus the religious groups, they are dealing with the situations every day. Even teachers. Teachers have to deal with these things every day in the schools. They too have a view. Madam Speaker, I want to touch briefly on the issue of the 3/5 majority, and by no way am I a constitutional expert, neither versed in the law, but I have asked questions about it, and I've had some layman comments and so on, and I wish to share it. And my question is, why was the 3/5 majority requirement removed from this bill? Now, I understand the Attorney General's explanation as we started the session today. I understand most of what he said. But why was it removed with this bill?
And the manner in which it was removed.
The manner in which it was removed. But my question is, we spent 6 months laboring on bills prior. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say de facto bill. And why didn't we pull the 3/5 majority from that bill? And we would have, we wouldn't have suffered the country as they claim that we did. In any way, why couldn't we pull the 3/5 requirement from the bail amendment bill? Look, we have the insurance and gambling bills and so on. Why don't we pull the 3/5 from those bills? So the question to me, Madam Speaker, why this bill? Why this particular bill that we should pull the 3/5 requirement? So that is a question I'm hoping that the Attorney General could answer when he wraps up. And then why now? Now, I remember in the other place when the AG was wrapping up, he would have mentioned that he expected to get very little or no support from the opposition when it reached the lower house, and it was a tactical move. My question is, why are we passing legislation by tactics? Legislation, especially legislation that is so sensitive, where we're impacting such a wide cross-section of our society, why are we not engaging in deliberation, participation, collaboration to write good laws? Why does it have to be a tactical approach? And perhaps the AG will explain it to me when he wraps up. But a 3/5 majority was put into our Constitution to do exactly that. That you would allow for deliberation, collaboration, and consultation when we are writing law that ought to be guiding our society into the future, Madam Speaker. But Madam Speaker, as one person said, that perhaps the AG hit the easy button, because I never saw the AG as being a man to quit, because he is very astute in his language and law and so on. So I found it a little strange that he chose to pull the 3/5, saying that it's a tactical move. And perhaps I think it was an easy way out. But be that as it may, I am really hoping by the time the debate is over today, the AG reconsiders on that particular aspect. I dare say I'm thinking that perhaps there may be, I hope he is not sabotaging his own bill, but let's see how that goes. Madam Speaker, this error to me in judgment in terms of removing the 3/5 majority really, to me it borders on a bit of negligence on how the architecture of our legislature should operate. And perhaps I stand corrected, but I feel that is something that we should be very, very careful that we are not attacking the democratic processes that is enshrined in our Constitution. Madam Speaker, in deciding how we close the debate of today, we must ask ourselves, what is the role of us as parliamentarians in this parliament? Should we, in the opposition, or as a matter of fact, any MP, or any parliamentarian, be bullied into passing any law, be it good law, be it bad law? Madam Speaker, do we bow to the public pressure, what I normally refer to sometimes as the mob on social media, because we are too afraid that we lose votes, or we are too afraid that we become unpopular? Do we take those things into consideration when we stand in here? Or do we demand that we pass good law every time? And we demanded good law in the FATCA debate, and we got good law, and we passed good law. Madam Speaker, the constitutional issues is one area of the conversation. But I want to focus directly on the pieces of legislation that is before us. And I want to ask and answer a couple questions. Is the context and content of the bill before us good law for the country, good law for us as a society to move forward? I think it is. I think it is. I have no doubt that the intent and the content is very good. Can it be improved? Yes, it can. Because we must take into consideration the views of the reality of those people involved in our society, which is the religious groups, the civil society, the NGOs. Their views must play an important role. So we want to make good law. Can it also be strengthened? I say put back the requirement for the 3/5 majority, put back it in the preamble back there, put back the certificate that is required. And when we pass the bill today, it would have gotten the approval by the will of every single citizen in this country, because we represent the other side in this country. So we must have a chance for our vote to make a difference. So I'm asking that we pass good law today, Madam Speaker, and that the Attorney General will reconsider. We must also never forget that we as legislators, we are like contractors who are building roads. And these roads, how we choose today, will either take our society into the future, or it can take us down a perilous road into the dark ages. So, I am all for passing good law. I think we all agree in this House that 18 is the route to go, but we cannot be naive to the point that there is also a reality of our circumstances that we ought to pay attention to. So let us do what is right and support this bill with amendments and to put back the 3/5 majority, and let's approve this bill and get on with the business of running this country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for St. Joseph.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I rise to make a contribution on this bill, I think we are doing this debate in a very opportune time, considering the season and the time of year we have just come out of, and that of which we are going into, and that is Shivratri. We have just left the period of Shivratri, and I have no intentions of talking about Carnival. I'm talking about Shivratri into Lent. And in the period of Shivratri, where we talk about destroying illusions and imperfections and try to get into the mode of constructive destruction to create something new. And then in the period of Lent, where it's a time of deep reflection and spiritual renewal, I think it is opportune that we are discussing this bill after Shivratri and into the period of Lent. I want to turn attention to a statement made by the Honorable Kamala Prasad-Bissessar on, I think, at the United Nations, carried on The Guardian of Friday, September 23, 2011. And the reason why I raised this, because a member of Princestown raised the issue of the legacy of Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar, talking about the September 2013, the Child Protection Task Force, and all the good projects were due to the People's Partnership. And I want to commend the member for Siparia for her words at the United Nations, which are, and I quote, "We must ensure that our generation leaves a legacy of 50% of women in political and other spheres of decision-making, and delivers tangible policies and action programs aimed at improving the lives of women and girls." And a Chinese proverb was quoted in that speech where she said, the member for Siparia, "Women hold up half of the sky." Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar went on further. International Women's Day on the UNC website of 7th March 2015. And I quote again. And the reason for quoting this, Madam Speaker, is that we have this opportunity here today to concretize and solidify the lofty goals of the member of Siparia in this piece of legislation today. Because if government is a continuum, let us finish today what you could not have finished between 2010 and 2015. And I say this with all respect to the Member of Parliament for Siparia. And on this International Women's Day, it is said, "I look forward to the establishment of our women's city centers in Port of Spain and San Fernando. These centers will offer services aimed at educating women on their rights." And if we are talking about rights of women, then we have to come down on an issue today. And I want to just correct or lead a discussion on two issues that came out of Mayaro. Mayaro tried to lead the population when he said that all marriages are religious. That is not so, my friend, because you can have civil marriages. So let's just put that on Hansard. And two, where he said that young girls at the age of 16 are young adults. We have to be careful because you made a very good point. You want to pass law. And when you are talking about the ages of children or girls, it has to be defined in law. And the different acts speak to different ages. So for instance, under the Children Act, a child means a person under the age of 18. Under the Bail Act, a young person as meaning a person who has attained the age of 14 but is under the age of 16. The Immigration Children's Act defines child as a person under the age of 16. But we try to rationalize it under the Family and Children Division Bill 2016, which seeks to harmonize all of these different ages. And it defines a child to mean a person under the age of 18. which is consistent with the meaning of a child in the Children's Act. So I think we could agree, all 41 of us here could agree, that when we speak about a child, we mean someone below the age of 18, whether in law. Because as you said, what we are doing here today is passing law. So I think we could all agree to that. When we mean a child for these purposes, we mean someone below the age of 18. Madam Speaker, we will be called upon here to vote on this issue. And there are three ways in which we can vote. We can vote no, but I think that will be wrong. I think history is calling us today to vote in a particular way. We can vote yes, which in my view will be the correct way to vote. However, the vote I will not like to see here today is abstention. Because when you abstain from a vote of this significance, an abstention means you are probably ambivalent about the issue. And I don't think any one of us here is ambivalent about the issue. It means abstention can mean mild disapproval that doesn't really cross a threshold. I don't think that is how we need to vote here today. Or you may want to abstain because you have a particular position which is not in harmony with public opinion out there, which is what Mayaro spoke about. Or you could abstain if you are not adequately informed about the subject. And I don't think any of us could abstain on any reasonable grounds on this vote. So we have to take a vote today. And I am hoping that the vote we take is a yes vote. What is child marriage then, Madam Speaker? Child marriage is considered to be a widespread violation of human rights. We could agree to that. All the literature speaks to it. But as the Honorable Attorney General pointed out, and I want to echo him, this is not a religious issue. This is not a Christian issue, a Muslim issue, a Hindu issue, and a Orisha issue. This is boiling down to a gender issue. And let us be perfectly clear on that. And I want to echo and support the Attorney General in saying this is not a religious issue. And I, like him, have been concerned that out there in the public domain, some persons have tended or wanted to paint it as a religious issue. But it is not a religious issue. It is a gender issue. And we could agree, I call no names, and we could agree that it disproportionately affects young girls more than young boys. And when you do that, in my humble view, it tells young girls that we place a lower value on you as a human being. And that is the crux of the matter. And we refuse to see you as equal to men.
That's what it says.
And we have to fight that urge and give our young girls the equal footing of that as men. Because when you marry off young girls, even if it's not happening regularly, what the law is telling a young girl is that the law does not recognize your worth, does not recognize your value and your equality. Correct. And that is what we are doing. So we have to work against that. Madam Speaker, what are some of the implications of child marriage, especially for girls? Because girls who marry early, suffer disproportionately than the young boys who get married. Because what happens is that the girl loses all control over her body. She is forced into early pregnancies. And as a current Minister of Health and a former Minister of Health in Barrier, Taria Sawa, all the data will show you that one of the highest rates of maternal mortality is teenage pregnancies. Their bodies are not fully developed as yet. But forget the physical impediments. What about the psychological trauma? The psychological trauma that these girls, You know, you all could be flippant across there. Right?
Ignore them. Ignore them.
But, Madam Speaker, the psychological trauma, the abuse, and very often when these girls want to leave their homes, they cannot find refuge back in their parents' homes. They are sent back into those same relationships. It is shown that teenage brides and teenage girls suffer from more depression than married women over the age of 18. They have more psychiatric disorders. They have lower self-esteem. And most importantly, in the 21st century, lower educational attainment. And I want to echo the Attorney General again. When you have these young girls with low educational attainment, and there's nothing wrong with being a laborer. There's nothing wrong with being any other profession. But when you have a young girl who has to drop out of school, being married to someone who is working for minimum wage, what are you preparing that girl for in life? A life of what?
She should marry a scientist.
A life of what? You need to marry and form a union where you could raise your family and aspire to own a home, aspire to own a motor car, aspire to send your children to university. That is what the Attorney General's argument was about. It has nothing to do with a scientist versus a politician. But we all want what is best for our children, right? So I want to ask our colleagues next door, because I will give you some more quotes about the Honorable Member for Superior. We have an opportunity here as 41 people today to give wings to all these lofty statements made by all governments in the past, especially from 2010 to 2015. So let us join together. Madam Speaker, what do we want for our children? As we journey through life, we have a life cycle. We are born, we grow, and so on. What do we want? What do we want for our children? We like them to have their first job, earn their first paycheck, their first graduation, be involved in sports. All of us here, I think, who are parents in this century, our children benefit more than when we were kids, because our parents then did not have the wherewithal to take us for dance, to take us for swimming, for tennis, and all those things. So we want children that could participate in all that life has to offer, so that the succeeding generation lives better than the generation that went before. And what are some of the most celebrated events in the life of a child? If you are Christian, you have a christening. If you are Muslim, you have a hakika. And if you are Hindu, you can have your barahi. And when you have these ceremonies, it represents to that child the value you place on their life. It heralds this child's entry into the bosom of the human race and into your family, and seeks to bring God's blessings upon that life. We protect our children from harm, both physical. For instance, Madam Speaker, it is our duty, according to the law, and we agree a child is somebody under the age of 18. Just to give you an everyday example about a parent's role to protect her child and nurture that child. Just an example. When we are teaching our children to ride a bike, we put on training wheels for them. We graduate them, and then they'll ride their two-wheelers. But then we also have to protect them psychologically. And marrying off young girls under the age of 18 does not protect them, in our humble view. And we teach them what is right and wrong, so that when they get married as an adult, they can make better decisions. And then we usher them into adulthood. We usher them into adulthood and hopefully teach them to make the right decisions in life. And marriage should then be a celebration of your adulthood. Marriage should not be a celebration of a 12-year-old, 13-year-old child, especially a female child, being betrothed to a 45-year-old person, a 50-year-old person. It just does not make sense. Madam Speaker, in researching for this, and I am not going to quote the article, I am just going to raise it because the views expressed in that article are so vile to me. Even though I am quoting the article, I don't want to take ownership of those words. I don't want those words to come out of my lips. But I want to draw attention to my colleagues opposite to an Express article of November the 10th, 2011, called Child Marriage Absurdity. And I have copies of it here, and I could pass it on to the member of Superior, but I wanted especially to pass it on to my colleague, the member for Chaguanas East, the Honorable Fazal Karim. Because this article, which I will not quote because it is so vile in its intent and so vile in its meaning, it quotes, it says, it is mentioning a person by the name of D. Parsuram Maraj, allegedly representing the views of an organization well known to my colleagues opposite. And I have copies, I will pass it on to you all, and you all could read it. It appeared in the Express of November 10, 2011. And I am hoping that D. Parsuram Maraj never found himself into the hallowed halls of high political office in this country. I am hoping so. Because the views expressed in that article are vile. But I have copies here, and I will make them available. No, sir, I don't even want to repeat it, even though it's not my words.
But you can't repeat it, you didn't say it.
Madam Speaker, to put this issue into some more context, I think one must look at how the laws dealing with child marriage have evolved over the years. And I seek your latitude in mentioning a case, and this case came out of a 1781 case out of the voyage of the Zong. The Zong was a ship. The voyage of the Zong. Not wrong, Zong. And the Zong was a slave ship. And this slave ship had a cargo of 470 slaves. And the ship ran out of supplies. As was normal practice then, remember, slaves weren't considered persons. They were considered chattel or property. As was normal practice then, to save supplies for the human beings, for the people on board the ship, you would jettison cargo and then make a claim on insurance for the value of the cargo. So the captain decided to jettison his cargo to save the people and then go to make an insurance claim. On that ship, the slaves who were jettisoned had not even gained reputation as passengers, but only as items of cargo. They were chattel. And today, 41 of us here have an opportunity, a pristine opportunity, to tell our young girls they are not chattel. At 12, they are not chattel, something to be traded for a dowry. They are not chattel. They are people deserving deserving of their childhood. Deserving of their childhood. And again, the law very often, Madam Speaker, has to catch up with modern thinking. The law very often lags behind technology. The law very often lags behind modern thinking. And we have an opportunity again, just as in the Zong, not to consider our young girls as cargo. And I want to refer to another case where the law had to evolve and evolve quickly. And that is the case of Regina VR, where for the first time it was held that a husband could be held guilty of rape if he had sex with his wife, and she said no. Prior to that case, a husband could not be held in law to have raped his wife. This is the type of law we are being asked to pass here today. Significant law, groundbreaking law. And again, the Attorney General needs to be heartily congratulated for this. Because what child marriage is, in my view, is legalized statutory rape. Let us eliminate that from our act. Madam Speaker, young children below the age of 18, and I think I have laid it out that a child under the age of 18, in law, we could agree, is a child. A marriage is supposed to be a union between equals. I think we could agree on that. Man, woman, equals. Joint property. But when you have a marriage between a 12-year-old girl and a 45-year-old man, she is automatically at a disadvantage because she cannot go to the bank with that man and sign a loan for the house. She cannot buy a car in her own name. But you want to marry her. Where? I mean, that is sheer lunacy. And I want to go back to the honorable statement of Paray at the UN. But, Madam Speaker, at the 57th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, March 2013, where the then UNC government was represented by Mrs. Marlene Coudray and Mr. Rodney Charles. This is what Mrs. Marlene Coudray said at the UN, representing the government of 2010-2015. They agreed to the conclusions on the elimination and prevention of all forms of violence against women and children. And I quote now, there must be reconciliation in matrimonial cases to ensure that the wife has the same rights and respect to property. The ability to contract, which I just said. As the husband, women must have the right to make contracts. But in this bill, in the current law, a 12-year-old girl cannot contract and have the same rights as her husband. So women must have the right to make contracts in their name without the permission of their husbands. This was the UNC's view at the United Nations, as expressed by the then Honorable Marlene Coudray and Mr. Rodney Charles. And they must have prompt and equitable legal remedies for victims of domestic violence. Madam Speaker, again, let us join hands today, and Honorable Member for Paray, let us give wings to your lofty goals and ideals, which are still relevant today. Your words of 2010, 2015 mean a lot, and I applaud you for it. But today we have an opportunity to take those lofty goals, lofty ideals, and give them wings and make them a reality. Madam Speaker, we are dealing with the law. And what about the global evolution of the law on this issue of child marriage? In trying to do some research, I went back to as far as 1860. 1860. Raja Ram Mohan Roy in India. He was a social reformist who interpreted the teachings of the East in the light of the West. And he was one of the first proponents I found for the abolition of child marriage in India. And he advocated strongly for women's rights. In 1929 in India, the Child Marriage Restraint Act defined you couldn't marry a girl under 14 and a boy under 18. Correct. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it stated people must be able to give free consent, and children can't give that type of free consent. In 1979, the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, and enshrined in that is the right to freely choose a spouse. In all of these child marriages,
Your original 30 minutes have expired. Are you going to be much longer?
not more than 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, so you have an additional 15 minutes. So if you take 5, we'll go to the suspension then.
Thank you. And the right to freely choose a spouse. The African countries are far ahead of us. 1990, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of Women. And one of the most progressive countries when it comes to child marriages is Bangladesh. All their laws between 1984 and 2014, and in India in 2006, the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006, where it quotes boys under 21 and girls under 18 are considered children. 1955. So, Madam Speaker, in asking the opposition support, I will again quote from the Honorable Kamla Prasad-Bissessar. Looking towards the future, one of the most important issues the national community must face is the widening gap between liberated, modern, independent women and our traditional men who are being left behind. And I think somebody spoke about that, how our girls are outperforming our boys. But we want our women, and I agree with the member for Siparia, to be liberated, to be modern, and to be independent. The question is, are we going to do that today? Let's not make those words rhetoric or PR. Madam Speaker, as I come to a close, I opened with a quote from a former Prime Minister, the Honorable Member for Siparia. And I will close with a quote from another Prime Minister from another time. A quote made 55 years ago, but it rings true today as it did 55 years ago. And it is as fresh today as the morning dew as it was 55 years ago. And I found that quote in my second favorite book of all time, The Student's Companion. And with your permission, Madam Speaker, I will close with a quote from The Student's Companion, second favorite book of all time. The Bible, the Gita, or the Quran. I give them all three. This quote, Dr. Eric Williams, Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, message to the youth of the nation at Independence Youth Rally, 30th August 1962, and I quote, "To your tender and loving hands, the future of the nation is entrusted. In your innocent hearts, the pride of the nation is enshrined. On your scholastic development, the salvation of the nation is dependent. When you return to your classes after independence, remember, therefore, each and every one of you, that you carry the future of Trinidad and Tobago in your school bags. That is where our children need to be, in school." Madam Speaker, I thank you.
Member for Paray, we'll take the suspension now and return at 5 o'clock.